My wife was gasping for life on our kitchen floor, but the ambulance couldn't reach her because HOA President Delilah Thornfield had blocked our bridge with trash cans and violation notices at 6 a.m. 12 torturous minutes ticked by as paramedics stood helpless, their sirens screaming across the creek while Delilah sat smug in her white Lexus, sipping her morning latte. She thought she was bullying a helpless couple, but she'd crossed an Army combat engineer who builds with his bare hands and a librarian wife who can shred her HOA rulebook. What would you do if a neighbor's petty power trip nearly stole your loved one's life? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This HOA nightmare could strike your town next. I'm Marcus Delacroix, 52 years old, and I've been building custom furniture in the mountains outside Asheville, North Carolina for 8 years. After 24 years as an Army combat engineer, working with my hands beats filing paperwork any day. My workshop sits on 3 acres that my grandfather left me, the same land where he built a timber bridge in 1963 using techniques that would make modern contractors weep with envy. My wife, Elena, 48, works part-time at the county library and researches like a detective on espresso. The woman can find dirt on anyone buried in public records, and she's got the patience to dig through decades of bureaucratic nonsense. Our only worry was Elena's heart condition, managed with medication and the kind of mountain peace that money can't buy. Our property predates the Willowbrook Springs subdivision by 40 years. When developers carved up the surrounding farmland in 2005, they built McMansions around us like we were some historical landmark they couldn't bulldoze. We became the rustic holdouts in a sea of beige vinyl, and some people hated that authenticity with burning passion. Enter Delilah Thornfield, 59, HOA president for 8 years running, and the kind of woman who irons her workout clothes before hitting the gym. She drives a white Lexus that gets detailed more often than most people shower and lives in an $800,000 monument to her own ego. The musty smell of her over-powdered makeup could knock a buzzard off a garbage truck at 50 yards, and her voice has that particular nasal quality that makes fingernails on chalkboard sound melodic. This woman once forced elderly Mrs. Hazel to remove her handicap ramp because it disrupted the architectural flow. Yeah, wheelchair accessibility really ruins the neighborhood vibe. She's also the type who measures grass height with an actual ruler and sends violation notices if your mailbox isn't the exact shade of approved beige. My custom furniture business had been thriving. Wealthy folks in Charlotte pay good money for handcrafted dining sets and bedroom suites. That Tuesday morning in October, I was delivering a cherry wood dining room set that had taken me 3 months to perfect. Every joint hand cut, every surface sanded to silk smoothness. The sweet smell of wood stains still clung to my clothes as I loaded my truck at 5:30 a.m. Elena had some chest discomfort the night before, but her cardiologist had just adjusted her medications. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from our chimney as I tried not to wake her. She looked peaceful sleeping, dark hair spread across the pillow. 40 minutes later, my phone rang. "Marcus." Elena's voice was barely audible. "Can't breathe. Chest crushing." Click. I whipped that truck around doing 80 in a 65 zone, calling 911 while my heart hammered like a jackhammer. Dispatch knew our address. They'd responded twice before via our bridge. 27 minutes later, I screeched into our driveway to find paramedics standing uselessly across Beaver Creek. Orange cones blocked our bridge like some twisted obstacle course. Fresh HOA violation notices fluttering like surrender flags. Diesel exhaust from the idling ambulance mixed with my panic, creating a toxic cloud that burned my lungs. Elena lay unconscious on our kitchen floor, skin gray as winter clouds. While I performed CPR, paramedics waded knee-deep through icy creek water, equipment bags held overhead like they were storming beaches. 12 minutes instead of 3. 12 minutes that changed everything. Emergency access interference violates Federal Section 1983. Blocking life-saving services triggers civil rights violations with personal liability for officials. At the hospital, Elena's cardiologist delivered the verdict. Delay-related heart damage, uncertain prognosis, months of rehabilitation. The additional muscle death was preventable. That evening, I knocked on Delilah's door. She appeared in silk robes, wine glass in hand, clearly annoyed. "Your bridge violated setbacks. Posted notices after eyesore complaints. My wife nearly died because you blocked emergency access." Her eyes narrowed like a predator. "Your grandfather's footbridge was quaint for the 60s, Marcus. This is a gated community. Property values trump sentiment." She shoved a violation notice at me, time-stamped 6 a.m., but I'd left at 5:30. Those notices weren't there then. Delilah just made her first mistake. The next morning, Delilah launched her opening assault with the precision of a woman who'd perfected bureaucratic warfare over 8 years of HOA tyranny. She filed a formal complaint with county code enforcement, claiming my grandfather's bridge lacked proper permits. Technically true, since nobody worried about creek crossing permits in 1963. Back then, if you needed to cross water, you built a bridge and got on with your life. Her complaint letter read like a legal brief written by someone with too much time and too little human decency. "Unpermitted structure poses safety hazards to community," she wrote, as if my 60-year-old bridge was suddenly going to collapse and take out half the subdivision. But Delilah wasn't stopping there. She hired a private surveyor to verify property line encroachment. Some guy named Brad who drove a lifted pickup truck that burned more fuel than a small aircraft and wore wraparound sunglasses indoors like he was protecting state secrets. The beeping of his measuring equipment across my land at 7 a.m. felt like a military invasion, and his boots left muddy prints on my grandfather's carefully laid stone walkway. The man used enough hairspray to damage the ozone layer, and his cologne could be detected from 3 counties away. Watching him stumble around my property with expensive equipment he clearly didn't understand was like watching a toddler perform brain surgery. Meanwhile, Delilah started her whisper campaign. Suddenly, neighbors who'd waved cheerfully for 8 years crossed the street when they saw me coming. At the grocery store, conversation stopped when I walked down aisles like I was carrying some contagious disease. She'd planted seeds about me being difficult and threatening, painting herself as the innocent victim of some unhinged veteran. But here's what she didn't know about Army engineers. We document everything like our lives depend on it. I started photographing every interaction, timestamping conversations, and keeping records that would make military intelligence proud. Elena, bless her librarian heart, turned our dining room into a research command center that looked like something from a spy thriller. My first counterattack was a trip to the county courthouse, where I spent 2 days digging through dusty incorporation documents. The musty smell of old paper and bureaucratic negligence hung thick in the basement records room, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps overhead. What I discovered made my blood pressure spike and my confidence soar simultaneously. My property had been explicitly grandfathered when the HOA formed in 2005. The original filing stated clear as mountain spring water that pre-existing structures and improvements shall remain in perpetual compliance regardless of current community standards. I remembered reading somewhere during my Army days that grandfathering laws protect property improvements that predate new regulations under something called non-conforming use statutes. Looked like that random legal trivia was about to save my bridge. Armed with this legal ammunition, I visited attorney Janet Morrison, who charged me a $500 retainer I could barely afford after Elena's medical bills. Her office smelled like leather-bound law books and expensive coffee, and she delivered the good news with professional satisfaction. My bridge had legal protection that even Delilah's inflated ego couldn't touch. But Delilah escalated again. She convinced 3 neighbors to file nuisance complaints against my bridge, claiming it created increased traffic and safety hazards. The irony was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. She was calling my bridge a safety hazard after nearly killing my wife by blocking emergency access to it. Then came the Facebook posts that really got my attention. Delilah created a neighborhood group called Willowbrook Community Standards and posted a lengthy rant about entitled residents who think rules don't apply to them. She never mentioned my name directly, but everyone knew exactly who she meant. The post got 47 likes and dozens of comments from neighbors I'd considered friends. That's when Elena made her first major discovery that changed everything. While I was focused on defending my bridge rights, she'd been digging deeper into HOA records like the research bloodhound she was. "Marcus, come look at this," Elena called from her laptop fortress. She'd been cross-referencing HOA violation records with county assessor data, working late into the night with the determination of a detective solving a cold case. What she found made my stomach turn with anger and my heart race with possibility. Delilah had filed complaints against 12 different families over the past 2 years, but there was a clear pattern that revealed her true nature. Every targeted family was either elderly, working class, or what polite society calls visibly different. Mrs. Hazel with her handicap ramp, the Rodriguez family with their vegetable garden, the Johnsons with their teenager's basketball hoop. But she'd never filed a single complaint against families who looked like they belonged in her country club fantasy. The Morrison family's illegal pool house got a pass. The Hendersons' oversized fence was ignored. Brad Whitman's RV sat in his driveway for 8 months without a peep from the HOA. Elena had just handed me the evidence that Delilah wasn't enforcing community standards. She was enforcing social prejudices. And suddenly, this wasn't just about my bridge anymore. This was about taking down a bully who'd been terrorizing our entire neighborhood for years. The hunter had just become the hunted, and she didn't even know it yet. 3 days after Elena's discovery, Delilah escalated from petty harassment to outright character assassination. She filed a police report claiming I had menaced her during our bridge dispute, painting herself as a frightened victim of some unhinged veteran. The responding officer, a young guy named Martinez who looked like he'd rather be investigating actual crimes, dutifully took notes while I explained the situation. "Sir, she says you threatened her with military tactics," Officer Martinez said, struggling to keep a straight face. The whole thing was so ridiculous that even he seemed embarrassed to be there. The crisp morning air carried the sound of his radio crackling with real police business while we discussed my alleged intimidation techniques. "Officer, the only military tactic I used was standing on her porch and asking questions, unless basic communication skills count as psychological warfare now." Martinez left without filing charges, but Delilah wasn't finished with her victim performance. She marched straight to the courthouse and demanded a restraining order, claiming she feared for her safety. I'd seen this kind of manipulation in the Army, people who weaponize the system when they can't win fair fights. The judge took one look at her dramatic testimony about my intimidating presence and denied the request faster than you could say frivolous lawsuit. But denial didn't stop Delilah from escalating her harassment campaign. She started parking her pristine white Lexus strategically to partially block my driveway access, forcing me to squeeze my truck past her bumper every morning. The metallic scrape of her car alarm going off became the soundtrack to my daily commute, triggered by the slightest vibration from my passing vehicle. The acrid smell of her expensive leather interior mixed with her overpowering perfume, creating a toxic cloud that lingered in my garage long after she'd driven away. Meanwhile, Elena had transformed our dining room into a research fortress that would make CIA analysts jealous. Legal documents covered every surface, and she'd created a color-coded filing system that tracked Delilah's violations with military precision. The sweet smell of Elena's vanilla candles mixed with the mustiness of old paperwork, creating an oddly comforting atmosphere for our war room. "Marcus, you need to see this," Elena called from behind her laptop fortress. She'd been spending nights at the county recorder's office, digging through decades of property records with the determination of an archaeologist hunting buried treasure. Her fingers were stained with ink from old document copies, and her eyes had that excited gleam they got when she'd uncovered something big. What she'd discovered was pure gold wrapped in bureaucratic ribbons. My grandfather's bridge didn't just predate the subdivision, it predated the entire development by 60 years. The original creek crossing had been documented in 1962 construction photos that Elena found buried in our family albums. Black and white pictures showing my grandfather, sleeves rolled up, positioning timber beams with the same careful precision I used in my furniture work. But Elena's real breakthrough came when she started researching HOA election irregularities. During my Army years, I'd learned that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Turns out Delilah's 8-year reign hadn't been as democratically legitimate as she claimed. Elena discovered voting discrepancies, missing ballots, and meeting minutes that had been altered after the fact. While I was focused on defending my bridge, Elena uncovered something that made my blood boil and would make any lawyer's eyes light up like Christmas morning. She'd cross-referenced property ownership records with HOA violation patterns and found a smoking gun that could blow this whole thing wide open. Delilah's own property had multiple code violations that somehow never made it onto any official HOA violation list. Her pool house, built in 2019, lacked proper permits. Her decorative fence exceeded height restrictions by 18 inches. Her landscape lighting violated the county's dark sky ordinance so blatantly that planes probably used her backyard as a navigation beacon. "How did you find all this?" I asked, watching Elena organize her evidence with librarian efficiency that would make military quartermasters weep with envy. Property records are public, building permits are public, and HOA meeting minutes are supposed to be public. When someone's been playing favorites for 8 years, the paper trail tells the whole story. She handed me a thick folder that felt like holding dynamite. The pattern was crystal clear. Delilah had been selectively enforcing rules based on her personal prejudices, targeting families she considered beneath her standards while ignoring violations from her country club crowd. That weekend, I filed counter-complaints about every single one of Delilah's violations. The irony was delicious. She'd spent years wielding HOA rules like a weapon, and now those same rules were pointed straight back at her. I also submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for all HOA board meeting minutes from the past 5 years. I remembered reading that these requests apply to many HOA documents since they're quasi-governmental entities, and Elena had confirmed that homeowners have legal rights to this information. What came back was even more damning than we'd expected. Meeting minutes showed Delilah had approved her own pool house construction in a closed executive session, voting on her own variance request without recusing herself. The documents revealed a consistent pattern of selective enforcement that would make a federal prosecutor start taking notes. But Delilah wasn't going down without a fight. She hired her own private investigator, her nephew Brad with the loud truck and enough cologne to choke a horse. His surveillance attempts were about as subtle as a marching band, and twice I caught him trying to photograph my property while standing in plain sight wearing neon orange hunting gear. The woman thought she was playing chess. She was about to learn that some games end in checkmate. By the second week of November, Delilah had moved into full desperation mode, and desperate people make dangerous mistakes. She called the county health department claiming my bridge created stagnant water issues that posed environmental hazards to the community. The inspector who showed up looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, trudging through crisp autumn leaves to examine my perfectly functional 60-year-old bridge. "Ma'am, this creek flows faster than most rivers," he told Delilah, who'd insisted on supervising his inspection while wearing designer boots that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "There's nothing stagnant about this water. If anything, your neighbor's bridge helps prevent erosion downstream." But Delilah wasn't done with her environmental crusade. She hired an environmental consultant, surprise, surprise, her nephew Brad again, to write a damaging report about supposed ecological damage. The man who couldn't operate a measuring tape was now apparently qualified to assess water quality and wildlife impact. His report read like it was written by someone who'd learned about the environment from watching nature documentaries while heavily medicated. The smell of his diesel truck idling for hours while he pretended to conduct scientific observations filled the air with enough toxic fumes to actually create an environmental hazard. I caught him napping in his truck twice, and once photographed him dumping coffee grounds directly into the creek he was supposed to be protecting. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. But Delilah's real nuclear option came next. She threatened a special assessment on my property for community impact fees. I remembered reading during my legal research that special assessments can be devastating financial weapons when wielded by corrupt boards, basically legalized extortion with a bureaucratic bow on top. "Your non-compliant structure has decreased property values and increased insurance liability for the entire community," she announced at an emergency board meeting I wasn't notified about until after the fact. "A special assessment of $15,000 seems appropriate to cover remediation costs." The audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to charge me $15,000 for the privilege of keeping my own bridge on my own property. That's when Elena struck gold in her research mind, and everything changed. "Marcus, drop everything and look at this," she called from our war room, her voice carrying that particular excitement reserved for nuclear discoveries. She'd been digging into Delilah's business connections, following paper trails like a forensic accountant hunting fraud, and what she'd found was explosive. Elena had discovered that Delilah's family construction company, Thornfield Development LLC, had received over $180,000 in landscape improvement contracts from the HOA over the past 3 years. Every single contract had been approved in closed executive sessions without competitive bidding. The musty smell of corruption was stronger than the old documents Elena was photocopying. But the smoking gun was even more damning. 3 current board members had active contracts with companies owned by Delilah's relatives. The landscaping company that maintained common areas, owned by her brother-in-law. The security firm that installed the gate systems, her cousin's business. Even the company that cleaned the community pool was connected to her family network. Elena had uncovered a corruption scheme that would make Chicago politicians jealous. Delilah hadn't been running an HOA, she'd been operating a family enrichment program funded by homeowner dues. Here's where I launched my counterattack that Delilah never saw coming. Instead of just defending my bridge, I went on the offensive. I contacted every family she'd targeted over the past 3 years and shared Elena's research. Mrs. Hazel nearly cried when she learned about the corruption behind her handicap ramp removal. The Rodriguez family started documenting every interaction they'd had with Delilah's inspections. Then I called local newspaper reporter Sarah Martinez, who specialized in government corruption stories. When I showed her Elena's evidence wall, her eyes lit up like she'd just discovered the next Watergate scandal. "This isn't just about your bridge," she said, photographing our documentation. "This is systemic corruption involving public money and civil rights violations. Do you mind if I make some calls to the State Attorney General's office?" Within 48 hours, everything accelerated like an avalanche, gaining momentum. The reporter's preliminary story hit the newspaper's website, and suddenly our quiet neighborhood dispute became a regional corruption investigation. 2 more board members resigned rather than face scrutiny, and the remaining members were scrambling to distance themselves from Delilah's schemes. But here's the beautiful part. While Delilah was busy trying to remove my bridge, she'd never noticed that Elena and I had been systematically dismantling her entire power structure. Every threat she'd made, every illegal contract she'd approved, every civil rights violation she'd committed, it was all documented, time-stamped, and ready for prosecution. The woman who'd thought she could bully us into submission was about to discover that some fights don't end with surrender. They end with handcuffs. Her corruption empire was crumbling, and the best part was, she still thought she was winning. 3 weeks into December, Elena made the discovery that would change everything. She'd been spending her evenings at the county clerk's office, digging through deed records with the methodical precision that made her such a formidable librarian. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps as she photographed page after page of legal documents, her reading glasses reflecting the glow of decades-old property descriptions. "Marcus, you need to sit down for this," she said when I found her hunched over our dining room table at midnight, surrounded by legal documents that looked like they'd been unearthed from King Tut's tomb. The sweet smell of her vanilla candles mixed with the musty odor of old paper, creating an atmosphere that felt both cozy and monumentally important. What Elena had discovered buried in the original 1961 subdivision deed restrictions would make any property lawyer weep with joy. The deed explicitly protected existing creek crossings and agricultural access routes, in language so clear that even a first-year law student couldn't misinterpret it. But more importantly, these protections were written in perpetuity, legal speak for forever and ever, no matter what. "Look at this," Elena said, her finger tracing the faded typewritten text that looked like it had been pecked out by a secretary who charged by the hour. "All pre-existing improvements, including but not limited to bridges, roadways, and utility crossings, shall remain in permanent compliance regardless of future development or community association formation. The original subdivision developers had explicitly grandfathered my grandfather's bridge, not just for the lifetime of the structure, but for all time. Any attempt to remove it violated the foundational legal documents that created Willowbrook Springs in the first place." But Elena's research revealed something even more devastating to Delilah's position. The HOA's incorporation documents directly contradicted these deed restrictions, which meant the HOA itself had been operating illegally for 18 years. When I was learning military law, instructors always emphasized that you can't give away rights you don't possess, and the HOA had never possessed the authority to regulate pre-existing structures. Elena had found the smoking gun that would blow Delilah's case apart, but she'd also uncovered something that could dissolve the entire HOA like sugar in rain. "There's more," Elena continued, pulling out a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "The HOA's original lawyer, surprise, surprise, was Delilah's college roommate from Duke University. She apparently overlooked the deed research requirements during incorporation. Either that, or she learned property law from a crackerjack box. This wasn't just legal malpractice. It was potential fraud that violated state real estate commission regulations. The entire HOA had been established on a foundation of either gross incompetence or deliberate deception, and Delilah had been wielding illegitimate authority for nearly 2 decades. The implications were staggering. Every violation notice she'd issued, every fine she'd collected, every family she'd harassed. It had all been based on legal authority the HOA never actually possessed. Mrs. Hazel's handicap ramp removal, the Rodriguez family's garden violations, countless other families terrorized by rules that weren't legally enforceable. Elena's discovery meant that Delilah's attempt to remove my bridge wasn't just wrong, it was a federal civil rights violation under Section 1983. She'd been acting under color of law without actual legal authority, which opened her up to personal liability that her insurance wouldn't cover. But the nuclear option was even bigger. If the HOA's incorporation was fundamentally flawed, every homeowner in Willowbrook Springs could potentially sue for recovery of dues paid to an illegitimate organization. We were talking about millions of dollars in potential liability. "How did you figure all this out?" I asked, staring at the evidence that could reshape our entire neighborhood. Elena smiled with the satisfaction of a detective who'd just solved a cold case. 25 years of research experience and a really good understanding of how lazy lawyers cut corners. Plus, I may have had some help from Mrs. Hazel's son, who happens to be a real estate attorney in Charlotte. The power dynamic had just shifted so dramatically that tectonic plates were jealous. Delilah thought she held all the cards, but Elena had just discovered that the entire deck was counterfeit. The woman who'd spent months trying to destroy my bridge was about to learn that her whole empire was built on legal quicksand. The next morning, my workshop transformed from a furniture-making space into the unofficial headquarters of what Elena dubbed Operation Bridge Freedom. The smell of sawdust mixed with fresh coffee as neighbors trickled in throughout the week, each carrying their own horror stories about Delilah's reign of terror. Mrs. Hazel brought homemade dumplings that could feed a small army, while Bob Morrison, a retired high school principal, arrived with a briefcase full of parliamentary procedure manuals that looked older than the Constitution. First things first, I announced to our growing resistance movement, spreading Elena's research across my workbench like a battle plan. We're not just defending my bridge anymore. We're taking down a corrupt system that's been stealing from this community for 18 years. Elena had created a presentation that would make Pentagon briefing officers weep with envy. Color-coded charts showed Delilah's family contract network. Timeline graphics tracked her selective enforcement patterns, and financial spreadsheets revealed corruption scope that would make Chicago aldermen take notes. The sweet aroma of Elena's vanilla organizational system mixed with the lingering scent of wood stain, creating an oddly comforting war room atmosphere. Our pro bono attorney, Janet Morrison, had recruited 2 colleagues after seeing Elena's evidence mountain. The legal team explained our 3-pronged attack strategy in terms simple enough for civilians to understand: civil rights violations under federal law, HOA dissolution under state regulations, and personal liability claims that would follow Delilah like a bad credit score. Here's what most people don't understand about Section 1983 lawsuits, Janet explained, her coffee mug steaming in the chilly workshop air. When HOA officials exceed their legal authority, they lose immunity protection. Delilah's been acting like a government official without government backing, which makes her personally liable for every rights violation she's committed. I remembered learning during my Army days that understanding liability laws could save your career, or in this case, save your community. Our community organizing strategy resembled a military campaign more than a neighborhood dispute. Elena created a private Facebook group called Willowbrook Truth that gained 45 members in 24 hours. Mrs. Hazel provided translation services for Korean neighbors who'd been targeted but afraid to speak up. Bob Morrison volunteered to coordinate meeting attendance using techniques he'd learned managing parent-teacher conferences, which was basically crowd control training with more coffee. The media strategy was Elena's masterpiece. She'd been corresponding with reporter Sarah Martinez, feeding her documentation in carefully timed releases that would build public interest without overwhelming readers. Channel 7 News agreed to film the upcoming board meeting confrontation, and social media hashtags like #WillowbrookRights were starting to trend locally faster than cat videos. Remember, Elena addressed our growing coalition, we're not just fighting for Marcus's bridge. We're fighting for every family that's been bullied, every elderly person who's been intimidated, and every working family that's been forced to choose between fighting illegal fines or feeding their children. But preparation wasn't just about legal strategy. I spent evenings building a physical timeline display that would visually demonstrate Delilah's corruption during the public confrontation. Each violation, each illegal contract, each civil rights abuse was documented with photos, dates, and supporting evidence. The display looked like something from a detective show, but every piece was meticulously researched and legally bulletproof. Elena designed presentation slides showing the direct contradiction between deed restrictions and HOA authority. Her librarian training and visual information design made complex legal concepts accessible to ordinary homeowners who'd been intimidated by bureaucratic language for years. Charts comparing Delilah's enforcement patterns revealed discrimination so obvious that even her golf club friends couldn't defend it. Our attorney prepared a cease and desist letter demanding immediate cessation of all bridge interference, but we decided to hold it as ammunition for the public meeting. The legal language was clear. Any further harassment would trigger immediate federal lawsuit filing with requests for emergency injunctive relief and punitive damages that would make her accountant cry. Meanwhile, Delilah was busy digging her own grave deeper with industrial equipment. She attempted to schedule an emergency executive session to avoid public scrutiny, apparently unaware that Elena had already documented this tactic as evidence of consciousness of guilt. She spread rumors about me planning a violent confrontation, which only served to make her look more desperate to anyone with functioning brain cells. The beautiful irony was that she'd hired private security for the board meeting, essentially admitting that she expected explosive revelations. Nothing says I'm totally innocent quite like hiring armed guards to protect you from angry homeowners armed with legal documents and PowerPoint presentations. Elena and I practiced our presentation like actors rehearsing for opening night. Every fact had to be presented clearly, every legal concept explained in language that wouldn't lose the audience, and every emotional beat calculated for maximum impact. We were preparing to dismantle 18 years of corruption in 15 minutes of public comment time. Mrs. Hazel's son confirmed that 3 other real estate attorneys were reviewing our case for potential class action representation. The corruption wasn't just local anymore, it was becoming a regional scandal that could reshape HOA oversight across North Carolina. The woman who thought she could quietly remove my bridge had accidentally triggered an investigation that would expose everything she'd worked to hide. Some fights end with surrender, others end with complete victory. December 21st brought Delilah's most desperate gambit yet, and it confirmed what we'd suspected all along. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. At 4 a.m., my security cameras captured her creeping across my property like some suburban ninja, sledgehammer in hand, attempting to sabotage the bridge that had become the symbol of her crumbling empire. The infrared footage showed her taking pathetic swings at the support beams, each impact about as effective as trying to demolish Gibraltar with a rubber mallet. When confronted the next morning by Officer Martinez, who was getting really tired of these calls, Delilah claimed she was conducting a structural integrity inspection for community safety. This from a woman whose only construction experience involved supervising pool house installations and telling contractors which shade of beige was acceptable. Ma'am, conducting structural inspections at 4 a.m. with a sledgehammer isn't exactly standard engineering practice, Martinez said, his patience wearing thinner than cheap toilet paper. The crisp winter air carried the sound of his radio crackling with actual police business while we discussed Delilah's midnight demolition fantasies. But her amateur sabotage attempt was just the opening act. Later that day, she filed another false police report claiming I had threatened her with military tactics and psychological warfare. The woman apparently thought my ability to organize neighbors and conduct research qualified as weapons of mass destruction. Meanwhile, Elena and I had been conducting our own investigation with the precision of Swiss watchmakers and the patience of librarians who dealt with decades of overdue book returns. We'd installed additional security cameras after the sledgehammer incident, creating a surveillance network that would make the Pentagon jealous. Then came the counterpunch that Delilah never saw coming. While she was busy playing amateur demolition expert, Elena had been working with Mrs. Hazel's attorney's son to file a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Commission about the HOA's illegal incorporation. I remembered reading during my legal research that real estate fraud carries serious professional license penalties, and Delilah's college roommate who'd botched the original HOA setup was about to learn that lesson the hard way. But Elena's real masterstroke was contacting the Internal Revenue Service about the HOA's tax-exempt status. Turns out, when you use organization funds for personal enrichment, the IRS gets very interested very quickly. Elena had documented every suspicious transaction with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant who actually cared about justice. Our documentation system had grown into something that would make prosecutors weep with joy. Every interaction with Delilah was recorded, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with witness statements. Elena had created spreadsheets tracking her corruption that were more detailed than most doctoral dissertations, and significantly more entertaining. The real breakthrough came when Elena discovered the smoking gun that would blow everything wide open. Hidden in HOA financial records, records that Delilah had tried to keep sealed tighter than Fort Knox, was evidence of kickbacks so blatant that even amateur accountants would spot them. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to invoices that would make any auditor reach for antacids. Thornfield Development billed the HOA $47,000 for emergency landscape restoration in March 2023, but the bank records show the money was transferred to Delilah's personal account the same day. We weren't just dealing with selective enforcement anymore. We were looking at embezzlement, fraud, and racketeering that would make organized crime families take notes. The woman who'd started a war over my grandfather's bridge had accidentally exposed a criminal enterprise that stretched back years. But here's where Delilah made her fatal mistake. She attempted to bribe 2 remaining board members with promises of lucrative maintenance contracts for their small businesses. Unfortunately for her, both conversations were recorded by wives who'd grown tired of their husbands being manipulated by a suburban crime boss with delusions of grandeur. The state attorney general's office had quietly opened a formal investigation after reporter Sarah Martinez forwarded Elena's research. White-collar crime investigators don't typically get cases handed to them with color-coded charts and cross-reference documentation, so our evidence package was apparently making prosecutors very happy indeed. Local FBI involvement became inevitable when Elena discovered that HOA funds had been used to pay for Delilah's personal vacation to the Bahamas, disguised as a community development conference. Using organization funds for personal expenses crosses into federal territory faster than you can say wire fraud, and the smell of federal prosecution was stronger than her nephew Brad's cologne. Our community coalition had grown to 67 families, each with their own Delilah horror story, each ready to testify about years of harassment and illegal fines. Mrs. Hazel had become our unofficial translator and morale officer, providing both linguistic support and enough homemade food to sustain a small revolution. The upcoming board meeting had been moved to the community center to accommodate the expected crowd, and 3 local news stations confirmed coverage. Delilah's attempt to avoid publicity had backfired more spectacularly than a fireworks factory explosion. Instead of a quiet neighborhood dispute, she'd created a regional scandal that would be studied in law schools. Elena finished preparing our final presentation while I put the finishing touches on the physical evidence display. Charts, graphs, photographs, and legal documents told the story of corruption so comprehensive that even Delilah's country club friends would struggle to defend her. The woman who'd thought she could intimidate us into submission was about to discover that some people don't just fight back, they fight to win completely. By New Year's Eve, Delilah had entered what could only be described as full panic mode, and her desperation was creating more evidence for our case than we could have manufactured ourselves. She attempted one final Hail Mary by filing an emergency restraining order claiming I posed community safety threats based on my military background and escalating behavior patterns. The irony was thick enough to serve as holiday dessert. The woman who'd been committing actual crimes was trying to paint me as the dangerous one. The judge who reviewed her request took exactly 47 minutes to dismiss it after viewing our surveillance footage of her 4 a.m. sledgehammer adventure. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said according to court transcripts, "the only escalating behavior I see documented here is your own increasingly erratic conduct. Request denied." But Delilah wasn't finished making terrible decisions. She tried organizing a counter-petition among her few remaining allies, going door-to-door with a clipboard and what neighbors described as the desperation of a door-to-door vacuum salesman during the Great Depression. The acrid smell of her anxiety was apparently stronger than her usual overpowering perfume, according to Mrs. Rodriguez, who politely declined to sign anything that might later be used as evidence of her own poor judgment. Her whisper campaign had evolved into full-throated character assassination attempts. She spread neighborhood rumors about my mental instability and Elena's obsessive research behavior, apparently unaware that calling a librarian obsessive about research was like criticizing a fish for being too wet. Most neighbors just nodded politely and then immediately called Elena to share what Delilah had said. Meanwhile, our evidence mountain had grown into something that would make Mount Rushmore look like a speed bump. Elena had been working with 3 different attorney teams, coordinating the civil rights case, the criminal referrals, and the class action lawsuit that was forming faster than storm clouds before a hurricane. The sweet smell of justice brewing mixed with Elena's vanilla candles, creating an atmosphere of impending victory. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything and proved that criminals are often their own worst enemies. Elena discovered that Delilah had been secretly recording HOA board meetings for years, apparently keeping the recordings as insurance against other board members. But in her panic to destroy evidence, she'd accidentally uploaded several recordings to the HOA's shared cloud storage instead of deleting them. I remembered reading that many white-collar criminals get caught because they document their own crimes. Apparently Delilah was following that playbook perfectly. "Marcus, you have to hear this," Elena called from our war room, her laptop speakers crackling with audio quality that sounded like it was recorded in a tin can, but the content was pure gold. Delilah's own voice discussing how to handle the Rodriguez family problem and make sure the Hazel woman doesn't cause more trouble. The recordings revealed conversations about targeting specific families based on ethnicity and income level, discussions about manipulating vote counts, and explicit planning to funnel HOA contracts to family members. We weren't just dealing with corruption anymore. We had documented evidence of civil rights violations and conspiracy that would make federal prosecutors excited enough to work overtime. But here's where I launched the counterpunch that would end this war once and for all. Instead of waiting for the board meeting, I contacted every major news outlet in North Carolina and offered them exclusive access to the recordings. By January 3rd, our story was featured on evening news broadcasts across 3 states, with Delilah's own voice providing the soundtrack to her downfall. The media attention triggered immediate responses from state and federal authorities. The North Carolina Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into HOA fraud across the region. The FBI confirmed they were reviewing our evidence for potential federal charges. The IRS began auditing the HOA's tax-exempt status with the enthusiasm of agents who'd discovered a new way to meet their annual quota. Elena had also been coordinating with affected families to document damages from years of illegal harassment. Mrs. Hazel's son was preparing a federal civil rights lawsuit that could result in damages exceeding $2 million. The Rodriguez family's attorney was filing discrimination claims that would follow Delilah for decades like a bad credit rating. Our community meeting attendance had swelled to over 100 families, many from neighboring subdivisions, who'd heard about our success in fighting HOA corruption. The movement was spreading faster than gossip at a church potluck, and other communities were asking Elena to help them investigate their own HOA problems. 3 days before the scheduled board meeting, 2 more board members resigned rather than face the investigation spotlight. Delilah was essentially governing alone, which was probably how she'd preferred it all along. Her isolation was so complete that even her nephew Brad had stopped conducting surveillance, apparently deciding that family loyalty had its limits when federal prosecutors started asking questions. The pre-meeting atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Local news trucks were already scouting parking locations at the community center. Elena had prepared a presentation that would systematically dismantle 8 years of corruption in 20 minutes of public comment time. The woman who'd started this war over a 60-year-old bridge was about to learn that some enemies don't just fight back. They fight until victory is complete and justice is served. January 15th arrived with the crisp clarity of a North Carolina winter morning, and the Willowbrook Springs Community Center buzzed with energy that could power the entire subdivision. By 6 p.m., an hour before the scheduled meeting, the parking lot was packed tighter than a holiday mall, with overflow parking stretching 3 blocks down Maple Street. The smell of anticipation mixed with cold winter air and the exhaust from 3 news vans created an atmosphere of impending historic confrontation. Standing room only didn't begin to describe the crowd that had gathered. Over 200 people packed into a room designed for 50, with neighbors standing along walls, sitting in aisles, and crowding around doorways like they were witnessing the trial of the century. Channel 7 had set up professional lighting that made the community center look like a movie set, while reporters from 4 different news outlets tested their microphones with the efficiency of seasoned war correspondents. Delilah arrived 15 minutes late in her white Lexus, followed by a black sedan carrying her attorney and what appeared to be private security. She'd hired a Charlotte firm that specialized in crisis management, apparently believing that professional spin could somehow transform 8 years of documented corruption into a simple misunderstanding. Her lawyer, a guy in a $1,000 suit, who looked like he'd rather be defending tax evaders, carried a briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Elena and I took our seats in the front row, our evidence binder thick enough to serve as a doorstop. The sweet scent of her vanilla perfume mixed with my nervous energy, creating a calming influence that steadied my hands as I prepared to deliver the presentation that would reshape our community forever. When the meeting was called to order, the room fell silent except for the quiet hum of television cameras and the occasional cough from the packed audience. Delilah attempted to maintain her usual imperious demeanor, but the tremor in her voice was audible even in the back rows. "Before we address tonight's irregularities," she began, her prepared remarks sounding as sincere as a politician's campaign promises, "I want to remind everyone that this community was built on standards of excellence that—" "Point of order!" Bob Morrison's voice cut through her speech like a sword through silk. His 30 years of managing high school faculty meetings had prepared him perfectly for this moment. "Mrs. Thornfield, you're not recognized to speak until public comment period. Parliamentary procedure requires board business first." The crowd murmured its approval while Delilah's lawyer whispered frantically in her ear. She'd lost control of the meeting before it had even begun, and everyone in the room could smell her panic stronger than her expensive perfume. When public comment finally opened, I stood with the confidence of a man who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. "Good evening. I'm Marcus Delacroix, And 18 weeks ago, my wife nearly died because this woman, I pointed directly at Delilah, blocked emergency access to our home with illegal barriers. The room was silent enough to hear a pin drop as I methodically presented Elena's research. Charts showing financial irregularities, photographs documenting selective enforcement, audio recordings of Delilah's own voice discussing how to target families based on ethnicity and income. This isn't just to blow up my grandfather's bridge, I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. This is about a criminal conspiracy that has stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from this community while systematically harassing families who didn't fit someone's narrow definition of acceptable neighbors. Elena took the podium next, her librarian training transforming complex legal evidence into clear, understandable facts that even Delilah's supporters couldn't deny. She presented the deed restrictions that proved the HOA had never possessed legal authority over my bridge. She showed financial records proving that Delilah's family had received over $300,000 in illegal contracts. She played audio recordings of Delilah planning to deal with families based on racial and economic discrimination. But the mic drop moment came when Elena revealed the final piece of evidence we'd been saving. 3 days ago, the FBI raided Delilah Thornfield's home and business offices, Elena announced, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. Federal prosecutors have filed charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, civil rights violations, and racketeering. The investigation has expanded to include HOA corruption across 6 counties. The room erupted. Reporters pressed toward the front. Cameras flashed like lightning during a thunderstorm. Delilah's face went white as winter snow, and her expensive lawyer started packing his briefcase with the speed of someone who'd just realized his retainer check might bounce. Fire Chief Reynolds took the microphone to testify about the life-threatening nature of blocking emergency access. County Commissioner Sarah Williams read a statement supporting deed rights and promising HOA oversight reform. Mrs. Hazel spoke through tears about the psychological damage of systematic harassment. By 9 p.m., the board had voted unanimously to rescind all bridge violations, dissolve the current HOA structure, and turn all financial records over to federal investigators. Delilah had slipped out the back door during the testimony, but 3 news crews followed her to the parking lot where she attempted to flee without comment. The woman who'd thought she could quietly remove my bridge had instead triggered the largest HOA corruption investigation in North Carolina history. Some battles end with surrender. This one ended with handcuffs. 6 months later, the morning sun cast golden light across my grandfather's bridge as I sipped coffee and watched the creek flow peacefully beneath the timbers that had started this whole war. The sweet smell of Elena's recovery garden mixed with the earthy scent of spring creek water, creating an atmosphere of hard-won peace that money couldn't buy. Even the birds seemed to chirp more cheerfully now that Delilah's reign of terror had ended. The immediate aftermath had been swift and more satisfying than watching karma work overtime. Delilah resigned her HOA presidency the day after the meeting, facing federal charges that would keep legal eagles busy for years. Mail fraud, wire fraud, civil rights violations, and racketeering. She'd managed to violate more federal laws than some organized crime families. Her sentencing hearing was scheduled for August, with prosecutors requesting 5 years in federal prison and full restitution to affected families. The criminal investigation had expanded beyond our wildest expectations. FBI agents discovered similar corruption schemes in 17 other HOAs across North Carolina, leading to what newspapers called the largest homeowner association fraud bust in state history. Delilah's college roommate, the lawyer who'd botched our HOA's incorporation, lost her license and faced her own criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud. Our class action lawsuit settled for $840,000 distributed among the 43 families who'd been illegally targeted over the years. Mrs. Hazel used her settlement to install a beautiful new handicap ramp that exceeded all accessibility standards, then sent Delilah a thank you card with a photo of the completed project. The Rodriguez family expanded their vegetable garden and started a community farmers market that drew customers from 3 counties. But the real victory was what we built from the ashes of Delilah's corrupt empire. The old HOA was dissolved and replaced with a voluntary neighborhood association that actually served residents instead of harassing them. Elena was elected president unanimously, bringing her research skills and genuine care for community welfare to an organization that now focused on neighborhood improvement instead of enforcement. My bridge was officially designated as a historical structure by the county, with a bronze plaque commemorating both my grandfather's craftsmanship and the community's fight against bureaucratic corruption. The inscription reads, "Some bridges connect more than land. They connect people to justice." The rough texture of the bronze plaque felt permanent under my fingers, like justice carved in stone. Elena's health had improved dramatically once the stress of constant HOA harassment ended. Her cardiologist marveled at her recovery, attributing it partly to reduced anxiety and partly to the satisfaction of having fought injustice and won. She'd returned to full-time work at the library, where she'd started a community legal research program helping other neighborhoods investigate HOA problems. My furniture business had exploded with orders from customers who'd heard our story on the news. Apparently, people were eager to buy handcrafted pieces from the guy who'd taken down a corrupt HOA president with nothing but determination and his wife's research skills. The irony was delicious. Delilah's attempt to destroy us had actually made us more successful than ever. We organized the first annual Bridge Festival in October, celebrating both my grandfather's legacy and our victory over petty tyranny. Over 500 people attended, including families from neighboring subdivisions who'd heard about our success. The festival raised $12,000 for a scholarship fund we'd established for families fighting HOA abuse. Our story had inspired similar resistance movements nationwide. Elena received weekly emails from homeowners seeking advice on fighting corrupt HOAs, and she'd helped expose fraud in communities from California to Florida. What started as a defense of one old bridge had become a movement for homeowner rights across America. Here's what we learned that could save your family from similar nightmares. Research deed restrictions before buying in any HOA community. They often override HOA authority and provide protection you didn't know you had. Document everything with timestamps and witnesses. Corrupt officials rely on people not keeping records, so become obsessive about photography and written communications. Emergency access interference can trigger federal civil rights claims. Blocking life-saving services opens officials to personal liability that insurance won't cover. State oversight offices have real power over rogue HOAs. Most homeowners don't realize these agencies exist and can investigate financial irregularities. Standing on that bridge now, watching neighbors wave as they walked their dogs along the creek path we'd established, I thought about how dramatically everything had changed. The acrid smell of diesel from emergency vehicles had been replaced by fresh mountain air. The sound of Delilah's threats had been replaced by children's laughter echoing across the water. Elena appeared beside me, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied smile of someone who'd fought injustice and won completely. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling against the bridge railing that had become the symbol of our victory. "Only one," I said finally. "I wish my grandfather could have seen how his bridge brought an entire community together." "Who says he didn't?" Elena replied, squeezing my hand as the morning sun climbed higher over our peaceful, corruption-free neighborhood. Share your HOA nightmare story in the comments below, because after hearing what we accomplished, you'll never look at neighborhood bullies the same way again. And smash that subscribe button for Karen stories if you love seeing justice served with a side of community victory. Because next week, I'm sharing how a parking ticket led to exposing $1 million municipal corruption scheme that'll make this HOA story look like small potatoes.